The copper dust was the first thing I noticed, not the gold of the Gilded Age, but a fine, oxidized powder settling into the cracks of the basement level in the old Chicago post office. It shouldn't have been there. It didn't belong to the architectural narrative of 1921. It belonged to something older, something buried. I looked at the blueprints provided by the city archives, and then I looked at the wall. The blueprints spoke of simple structural support, of standard load distribution, of brick and mortar intended to hold the weight of a growing republic. But the wall spoke of something else. It was too dense. It was too precise. I ran my hand over the surface and felt the vibration of a city that didn't know it was built on top of a ghost. Ask yourself why the official record stops exactly where the deep foundations begin. Ask yourself why the soil samples from the 1893 World's Fair site contain traces of conductive minerals that have no business being in a marsh. We are told the great fires of the 19th century were accidents of fate, of tipped lanterns and dry timber. But when you look at the maps, truly look at them, you see a pattern of strategic erasure. The fires didn't just burn buildings, they burned evidence. They levelled the grand, high-domed structures that the history books claim were temporary plaster constructions. Think about that for a moment. We are asked to believe that a society without heavy machinery or modern logistics built vast, neoclassical cathedrals of light and energy just to tear them down 6 months later. It is a lie. It is a calculated, institutional lie designed to hide the fact that we didn't build this civilization. We inherited it. We are the squatters in the ruins of a global empire that was systematically dismantled by an administrative order so absolute, so silent, that its name has been scrubbed from every ledger. What if the history of the world is not a line, but a series of resets? I stood in the shadow of the San Francisco Mint, watching the way the sunlight hit the granite blocks. The official story says this building survived the 1906 earthquake because of its superior construction, but look closer at the basement windows. They are half buried. They are the tops of arches that descend 20 feet into the earth. This is the mud flood phenomenon, a term dismissed by academic gatekeepers as a conspiracy, yet visible in every major city from Moscow to Melbourne. You see it in the red brick ruins of London and the granite megaliths of Boston, buildings with grand entrances that were clearly meant to be on the second floor, buildings with ornate subterranean masonry that no architect would waste time or money on if it were never meant to be seen. Not a mistake, not a stylistic choice, an inundation. Something happened in the mid-1800s, a cataclysm or a deliberate environmental shift that buried the previous layer of our civilization. And then came the administrators. They arrived with their shovels and their laws, digging out the tops of these structures and claiming them as their own. They called it the Gilded Age. They called it progress, but it was really a salvage operation. They found a world already built, a world with a global power grid that utilized atmospheric electricity, and they moved in. They rewired the domes, they stripped the copper, they replaced the free energy of the old world with the metered, taxed, and controlled power of the new. The administrative order wasn't just about dissolving a nation, it was about dissolving a memory. It was about making us believe that before 1850 we were nothing but horse-drawn primitives. I found a document in a private collection in Zurich, a fragment of a decree dated 1848. It didn't have a header. It didn't have a signature. It was written in a pseudo-academic dialect of Latin and French, a language of pure bureaucracy. It spoke of the harmonization of global chronology and the necessity of uniform heritage, not a suggestion, not a treaty, a mandate. It commanded the destruction of all genealogical records pertaining to the Great Khanate and the Grand Tartary. It ordered the relabeling of all Tartarian maps as Central Asian wastes. Why would an administrative body go to such lengths to delete a name? Because a name carries a frequency. A name carries a claim to the land. If you delete the name, you delete the owner. You turn a sovereign empire into a vacuum, and a vacuum is easy to fill with your own story. The erasure was total. They went into the libraries, they went into the cartography rooms, they replaced the ancient detailed maps that showed a unified, high-tech civilization spanning from the Urals to the Americas, with blank spaces and unexplored territories. They took the massive, star-shaped fortresses that dotted the globe, structures designed for frequency resonance and defense, and they renamed them coastal defenses or star forts built by the Vauban system. They told us these forts were for cannons, but the geometry is all wrong for ballistics. The geometry is for something else. It is for the distribution of energy. It is for the stabilization of the very ground we walk on. Think about the silence of the 1870s. After the supposed cataclysm, there is a period of eerie quiet in the archives. No newspapers, no letters, just a void. And then suddenly a burst of innovation. The light bulb, the telephone, the internal combustion engine. We are told these were the inventions of lone geniuses working in sheds. But what if they were just the rediscovered scraps of the world that came before? What if Edison and Tesla weren't inventing, but decoding? Tesla at least seemed to know. He spoke of pulling energy from the ether. He tried to rebuild the towers that the old world used as a matter of course, and they crushed him for it. They couldn't have the Grand Tartary technology coming back into the public sphere. It was too clean. It was too free. It made the administrative order unnecessary. So they tore down Wardenclyffe, just as they tore down the pavilions of the great exhibitions. They burned the blueprints. They neutralized the investigators. They ensured that the only energy we would ever know was the energy we had to pay for. This is the institutional gatekeeping at its most ruthless. It isn't just about money. It is about the hierarchy of knowledge. If you know how the world really works, you cannot be ruled. Therefore, you must be made to forget. You must be told that your ancestors were illiterate peasants and that the beautiful, impossible buildings in your city were built by men with chisels and pulleys in 18 months. I walked through the streets of Prague at 3 a.m., the time when the official world feels the thinnest. I looked at the astronomical clock. It doesn't just tell time, it tells the movement of a celestial system we no longer understand. It is a remnant of the pre-dissolution era. The administrators kept it because they liked the aesthetic, but they broke the mechanism that explained the true nature of our realm. They do that often. They keep the shell and destroy the core. It's what they did to the US Capitol. It's what they did to the Taj Mahal. These aren't just monuments, they are machines. They are resonators. The domes are capped with iron and copper for a reason. They are meant to be antennas, but today they are just tourist traps. The final administrative order wasn't a single paper. It was a series of synchronized actions across every continent, a global reset button. They changed the calendars. They added years to the timeline, the phantom time that turns a few centuries of history into a millennium of confusion. They created the Middle Ages as a buffer zone, a dark age where nothing happened, to hide the fact that the high civilization of the past was much closer to us than we think. not 1,000 years ago. 170 years ago. The ruins are still warm. Consider the orphan trains. Between 1854 and 1929, over 200,000 children were shipped from the east coast of the United States to the west. We are told they were the children of poor immigrants, but look at the photos. These children are well dressed, but they are hollow-eyed. They are being moved like livestock to repopulate the empty cities that the administrators had just finished cleaning out. Where did the parents go? Where are the records of the families? They were erased. These children were the blank slates. They were the first generation of the new world, raised in state-run institutions to believe the new history. They were told the cities they lived in were built by their fathers, even as they played in the shadows of ruins that their fathers couldn't possibly have conceived. This is how you steal a planet. You don't kill everyone. You just kill the adults and brainwash the children. You create a foundling culture. You make everyone an immigrant in their own land. You give them a new flag, a new religion, and a new debt-based economy, and you tell them they are lucky to have it. The Grand Tartary was dissolved not in a war of soldiers, but in a war of information. The logistics of the 19th century great exhibitions are a physical impossibility under the laws of the official narrative. The 1893 Chicago World's Fair, the White City, covered over 600 acres. It featured massive, ornate buildings, a moving sidewalk, and electric lights that surpassed anything in the world at the time. And we are told it was all built in 2 years, in a swamp, by people using horse-drawn carriages. And then, as soon as the fair was over, they burned it to the ground and threw the debris into the lake. Ask yourself, why? Why destroy such a feat of engineering? Unless it wasn't a feat of engineering at all. Unless the White City was already there. Unless it was an existing Tartarian city that had been unearthed, retrofitted with electric lights to show off the new technology, and then destroyed to prevent anyone from asking where it really came from. The fires were a forensic cleanup. They were removing the evidence of a superior architecture that didn't fit the Victorian timeline. They do it still. Every time a historic building with a domed roof and massive stone columns is demolished to make way for a glass box, the administrative order is still in effect. They are still scrubbing the skyline of the old world's greatness. I found a map from 1650 that shows California as an island. For years, historians laughed at this. They called it a cartographic error that persisted for a century. But what if the map was right? What if the geography of the Earth changed so violently during the 19th century cataclysm that the island of California was fused to the mainland? What if the mud flood was the result of a massive liquefaction event that reorganized the very crust of the Earth? The administrative order didn't just hide the people, it hid the planet. It gave us a fixed, static map and told us it had always been this way. But the old maps tell a story of a world in flux, of cities where now there is only desert, of inland seas where now there is only salt. The Grand Tartary was the steward of this world. They understood the relationship between the Earth's magnetic field and the human biological rhythm. They built their cities on ley lines. They used frequency to heal. The administrators, however, prefer us sick and disconnected. They gave us the grid, the literal electrical grid, to keep us trapped in a low vibration loop. They turned the Earth's natural resonance into a commodity. The staccato beat of the modern world is designed to prevent contemplation. We are kept in a state of constant low-level anxiety. We are told that we are on the verge of a climate collapse, a financial collapse, a societal collapse. This is a distraction. It is the fear reset cycle. If you are constantly afraid of the future, you will never look into the past. You will never notice that the administrative order is still being written every day in the halls of the UN, the IMF, and the central banks. They are the descendants of the men who dissolved Tartaria. They are the keepers of the Great Seal. They know that the power of the old world is still there, beneath the pavement, waiting to be tapped. But they have placed a lock on it. They have labelled it occult or pseudo-science to ensure that no reputable academic will ever touch it. The institutional gatekeeping is a wall of fire. If you try to pass through it, they will burn your career, your reputation, and your sanity. But I have seen the copper dust. I have felt the vibration. I know that the wall is thin. What if the final administrative order was never actually finished? What if the dissolution of Tartaria is a process that is still ongoing? Every time they rewrite a textbook, every time they renovate an ancient site until it is unrecognizable, they are still trying to kill the ghost. They are afraid. They are afraid because they know their world is a parasitic one. It cannot create. It can only co-opt and consume. It relies on us not knowing who we are. It relies on the silence of the arches beneath the street. But the arches are still there. The star forts are still there. The copper is still in the walls. And once you see it, you can never unsee it. You begin to realize that the mystery isn't that Tartaria disappeared. The mystery is how they managed to keep us from noticing for so long. The evidence is not hidden in secret vaults. It is hiding in plain sight in the very stones of our cities. Ask yourself, if the history they gave you is a lie, what else are they hiding? What if the world is not what you think it is? What if you are not who you think you are? The loop remains open. The investigation is just beginning. Not their story. Not our story. The truth. Something else. The silence of the census records in the 1880s is a scream if you know how to listen. I spent months in the basement of the National Archives tracking the population shifts that followed the supposed completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. The math does not resolve. We are told of a massive westward expansion, of pioneers in covered wagons taming a wilderness, but the numbers suggest an extraction. Thousands of people vanished from the eastern registries, while the western cities, Denver, Salt Lake, San Francisco, bloomed with tens of thousands of residents overnight. They didn't arrive by wagon. They were moved. I found a series of shipping manifests from the period labelled under Department of Resettlement, not a civilian agency, a paramilitary one. They moved people into pre-existing masonry shells. They assigned them roles. They gave them a history that began with the arrival of the train. Ask yourself why every major American city has a great fire between 1870 and 1910. Chicago, Boston, Seattle, Baltimore, Spokane. It is a statistical impossibility for a civilization to accidentally burn its most valuable assets with such rhythmic regularity. Unless the fire was the final administrative act. A fire doesn't just destroy wood, it allows for the regrading of the land. It allows the administrators to bury the first floors, to raise the street level, and to claim that the majestic stone foundations below were merely sewer infrastructure. They buried the truth under 12 feet of soot and new pavement. I tracked the flow of antiquities, during the late Victorian era. The sheer volume of Tartarian artifacts being moved out of Central Asia and into the private vaults of London and New York is staggering. These weren't just statues, they were technical components, high purity mercury, resonant crystals, and intricate brass gearing that defied the manufacturing capabilities of the time. The administrative order categorized these as curiosities or religious idols. This is the erasure trope in its most clinical form. If you label a piece of technology as art, you strip it of its function. You make it a decorative object for the elite to admire, while the masses are told it is a relic of a superstitious past. I spoke with a retired curator who had seen the uncatalogued crates in the Smithsonian's Sub-Level 4. He spoke of atmospheric collectors that still hummed with a low frequency even after a century of neglect. He spoke of maps etched into silver plates that showed a different arrangement of the stars, a sky that existed before the Great Reset. He was told to keep silent. He was told that these items were out-of-place artifacts that would only confuse the public. The gatekeepers don't just hide information, they manage the confusion. They ensure that the anomaly remains an anecdote, never a pattern. What if the Industrial Revolution was actually a regression? We are taught to view the transition from steam to internal combustion as an upward climb. But if you look at the load distribution of the old cathedrals, you see a mastery of physics that we have lost. These buildings were not designed for prayer, they were designed for resonance. The pipe organs weren't just for music, they were low-frequency generators. The stained glass wasn't just for stories, it was a series of filters for specific light spectrums. The administrative order didn't just dissolve a government, it dissolved a science. It replaced a holistic, frequency-based understanding of the universe with a fragmented, materialist one. They gave us thermodynamics to tell us that energy is scarce, that it must be burned, that it must be paid for. They hid the fact that the earth is a giant battery. They capped the obelisks. They removed the needles from the tops of the skyscrapers, the ones that pulled electricity from the ionosphere. Not a design change, a lobotomy. They cut the wires to the sky and told us to start digging for coal. It is the ultimate form of institutional control, making the population believe that the air they breathe is empty, when it is actually overflowing with power. The maps are the most damning evidence. In the mid-1700s, Tartaria, or Grand Tartary, was the largest country in the world. It is on the maps of Mercator. It is in the Encyclopaedia Britannica of 1771. And then, by the 1850 edition, it is gone. A landmass covering millions of square miles simply evaporates from the geopolitical record. We are told it was just a vague geographic term for the region. Imagine if, in 50 years, the United States was scrubbed from every map and replaced with North American wastes, and future historians claimed it was never a real country. That is the scale of the deception. The administrative order worked with the cartographers of every major power to coordinate the disappearance. They divided the land between the Russian Empire and the Qing dynasty. They created the Great Game as a fictional conflict to mask the systematic looting of the Tartarian heartland. They used the Crimean War as a distraction to finalize the borders. It was a global pincer movement. The East and the West conspired to kill the center, and once the center was dead, they rewrote the history of the world to make it look like the center had never existed. I found a letter from a surveyor in the 1860s sent from the middle of the Gobi Desert. He wasn't looking for minerals. He was looking for the master administrative node. He described finding a city of white marble, half buried in the sand, where the buildings were still warm to the touch. He described tubes of glass that ran beneath the streets, glowing with a soft blue light. His letter was intercepted. He was never heard from again, but his description matches the underground pneumatic systems that were briefly used in New York and London before being mysteriously decommissioned as impractical. They weren't impractical. They were part of a global transport network that bypassed the need for surface travel. The administrators didn't want us moving that fast. They didn't want us that connected. They wanted us isolated in our little boxes, dependent on their roads and their fuel. They filled the tunnels with concrete. They turned the stations into crypts. They told us that the idea of high-speed global travel before the airplane was a steampunk fantasy, but the tunnels are still there. If you go deep enough into the Paris catacombs or the Moscow metro or the New York subway, you will find sections of masonry that do not match the surrounding brick. You will find the blue glass. Ask yourself why the classical style is found in every corner of the globe. Why does a courthouse in Iowa look exactly like a palace in St. Petersburg, which looks exactly like a government building in Buenos Aires, which looks exactly like a post office in Manila? We are told it was a trend, revival, a global trend before the internet, before mass communication, in an era of sailing ships? No. It was a standard. It was the architectural language of the unified Tartarian civilization. It was a functional design that maximized the collection of atmospheric energy. The domes, the columns, the pediments, they were all part of the machine. The administrative order couldn't tear them all down. There were too many. So they colonized them. They put their own names on the doors. They added Victorian facades to hide the ancient stone. They told us that the colonial style was brought by the settlers, but the settlers didn't bring the stone. The stone was already there. The settlers were just the new tenants. The administrators gave them the keys and told them not to ask about the basement. The institutional erasure extends even to our bodies. I investigated the standardization of medical science in the early 1900s. The Flexner Report, funded by the same families who oversaw the administrative transition, shut down every vibrational, homeopathic, and electromagnetic healing school in the country. They replaced them with a chemical-based model. Why? Because the Tartarians understood that the human body is an electrical system. They used the resonance of their buildings to keep the population in health. They used frequency. The administrators couldn't monetize frequency. They couldn't put a patent on a vibration, so they declared it quackery. They gave us pills made from coal tar derivatives. They disconnected us from the Earth's natural pulse. They made us dense. They made us slow. They made us easier to govern. The somber reality is that we are living in a low-frequency shadow of what we once were. We are the diminished descendants of giants, walking through a world we no longer know how to operate. I stood on the edge of the star fort in Bortange, looking at the perfect fractal symmetry of the earthworks. From the ground, it looks like a hill. From the air, it looks like a circuit board. There are thousands of these across the planet. Some are made of stone, some are made of earth. All of them are positioned on nodes of the global energy grid. The administrative order calls them fortifications. But look at the design. The points of the star face inward as often as they face outward. They are not meant to stop an invading army. They are meant to focus a field. They are resonators. In the 1800s, many of these were repurposed into prisons or insane asylums. Think about the irony. The places meant to harmonize human consciousness were turned into places of confinement and madness. It was a literal inversion of the old world's intent. They took the light and turned it into a cage. They took the freedom of the Tartarian world and processed it through an administrative filter until it became law and order. The final administrative order was not just about land or energy, it was about the soul. It was a spiritual reset. They introduced the concept of scarcity into a world that had known abundance. They created the idea of linear progress to keep us looking forward so we would never look back. They made us believe that we are at the pinnacle of human achievement while we live in the decaying carcasses of a much greater era. Not this, not that, something else. The something else is the truth that is too big to see. It is the realization that the entire modern world is a temporary structure built on top of an eternal one. The administrators know their time is limited. They know the copper dust is rising. They know that the vibration cannot be suppressed forever. They are trying to finalize the order, to lock the world into a digital grid that will replace the physical one they destroyed. They want to finish what they started in 1850. Ask yourself why you feel a sense of loss when you look at an old photograph of a city you've never visited. Why the world's fairs feel like a dream you once had. It is because the memory is in your marrow. It is because you are a part of the Tartarian lineage, no matter what your passport says. The administrative order can burn the books and they can bury the buildings, but they cannot erase the frequency of the blood. The unresolved loop is not in the archives, it is in you. What will you do when you realize the forbidden knowledge is just your own forgotten heritage? What will you do when you see that the authorities are just the scared caretakers of a stolen empire? The investigation does not end with a document. It ends with a choice. To continue living in the simulation they built for us, or to start digging. The soil is waiting, the ruins are calling, and the administrative order is just a piece of paper. The hum of the modern city is a masking frequency. I stood beneath the vaulted ceilings of Grand Central Terminal, a space that the history books claim was completed in 1913. But look at the stone, look at the way that light interacts with the mineral composition of the walls. This is not mere granite, it is a resonant material specifically chosen for its ability to conduct and amplify. The administrative order tells us this is Beaux-Arts splendor, a triumph of the Gilded Age. But ask yourself, why would a railroad company invest in the acoustics of a cathedral? Why are there celestial maps on the ceiling that do not align with the constellations of the 20th century? They are the remnants of a navigation system that didn't rely on satellites. They are the artifacts of a culture that understood the Earth as a coherent, vibrating organism. The investigators of the 1920s were purged from the academy for suggesting that these transit hubs were built on top of much older, much more sophisticated energy nodes. Not a station, not a palace, a gateway. The administrators didn't build Grand Central, they excavated it. They cleared out the silt of the mid-19th century cataclysm and laid their tracks through the existing tunnels. They claimed the glory of the vaulted heavens while keeping the public confined to the subterranean platforms. This is the institutional gatekeeping of space itself. They occupy the high ground of our history and tell us we are lucky to be allowed in the lobby. Consider the Great Survey of the American West. Between 1867 and 1879, 4 major expeditions were sent out to map the wilderness. We are told they found nothing but rocks, buffalo, and indigenous tribes. But the photographs tell a different story. If you look at the glass plate negatives, the ones that haven't been restored by the state-sanctioned archives, you see ruins. You see massive weathered columns in the middle of the Nevada desert. You see the foundations of cities in the Grand Canyon that look suspiciously like the ruins of the Indus Valley. The administrative order classified these as natural formations or geological anomalies. They gave them names like the Temple of Isis or Cheops Pyramid to make them seem like metaphorical tributes rather than literal structures. This is the erasure trope in its most geographic form. If you call a building a mountain, people stop looking for the doors. They stop asking who lived there. They stop wondering how a global Tartarian empire managed to maintain a presence on every continent simultaneously. The Wild West wasn't a frontier, it was a graveyard. The pioneers weren't discovering new land, they were scavenging the wreckage of a civilization that had been dissolved by a decree they couldn't even read. I found a ledger in a shuttered library in New Orleans, hidden behind a false wall of standardized textbooks. It was a record of the sanitation department from 1855. It didn't list trash collection. It listed the removal of anomalous masonry and the filling of subterranean voids. Page after page of coordinates where the city was literally being leveled and raised. They weren't fixing the drainage, they were burying the evidence of the world before. The administrative order required a uniform street level. This is the pseudo-academic language used to justify the systematic burial of the first floors of our heritage. What if the basements of our oldest buildings are actually the parlours of the previous age? What if the catacombs were the original thoroughfares? The tension of this realization is unsettling because it suggests that we are walking on the roofs of our ancestors. We are living in the attic of a mansion we have been told is a bungalow. The administrators want us to feel small. They want us to feel like we are the first ones to ever achieve anything, so we don't realize how much we have lost. They replaced the free energy obelisks with the smokestacks of the coal era, and they called it the Enlightenment. What if the full civil war was not about what we were told? If you look at the theatre of operations, the most intense destruction occurred at the sites of the most significant Tartarian infrastructure. The scorched earth policy wasn't just about breaking the spirit of the enemy, it was about breaking the back of the old world's grid. They targeted the foundries, they targeted the libraries, they targeted the star fort configurations that hadn't yet been converted. The administrative order used the cover of war to carry out a global demolition project. Not a conflict of ideologies, a conflict of eras. They needed to wipe the slate clean before they could implement the new financial system. They needed to ensure that the Grand Tartary was not just defeated, but forgotten. The staccato rhythm of the cannons provided the percussion for the erasure of 1,000 years of history. And when the smoke cleared, the administrators emerged as the victors, holding the deeds to a world they had just finished burning. They turned the battlefields into parks and the ruins into monuments, ensuring that no one would ever dig deep enough to find the blue glass or the copper dust. I traced the lineage of the educational boards established in the 1890s. The same names appear again and again. The same families who funded the great exhibitions and the resettlement programs. They were the ones who designed the modern curriculum. They were the ones who decided that Tartaria would no longer be mentioned in the classroom. They replaced the complex, cyclical history of the old world with a linear narrative of primitives to progress. They made it so that anyone who questioned the timeline would be labelled a crank or a conspiracy theorist. This is the psychological administrative order. It is the fence built around the mind. If you control what a child believes is possible, you control what the adult will ever see. They taught us that the pyramids were built with copper chisels and that the great cathedrals were built by illiterate masons. They made the truth seem impossible so that the lie would seem logical. But the logic fails when you look at the load distribution. The logic fails when you look at the atmospheric collectors on the rooftops of the 1800s. The logic fails because it was never meant to be true. It was only meant to be official. Ask yourself why the administrative order is so obsessed with clocks. Everywhere you go in the modern world, you are surrounded by synchronized time. This was not the case before the mid-19th century. Time used to be local. Time used to be solar. Time used to be fluid. The administrators imposed standard odd time to coordinate the railroads, yes, but also to coordinate the frequency of human thought. They locked us into a mechanical rhythm that is at odds with the Earth's natural pulse. They made us servants of the second hand. They did this to disconnect us from the great cycle of the Tartarian world. They wanted us to live in a state of perpetual now, divorced from the deep past and the potential future. They turned time into a commodity, something to be spent or saved, rather than something to be experienced. This is the somber reality of our existence. We are being pulsed at a rate that keeps us from noticing the vibration of the stones. We are being timed so that we don't have time to think. I found a photograph of a star fort in India that was being restored by the British colonial administration in 1860. In the background, you can see the workers removing massive copper coils from the central plaza. The caption calls them ceremonial decorations. But look at the thickness of the wire. Look at the way they are being handled with insulated gloves. These weren't decorations. They were the core of the power plant. The administrative order wasn't just dismantling a country, it was stripping the copper out of the world's veins. They sold the scrap to fund the new utilities that would then charge the people for the very energy they used to get for free. Not a theft, a privatization. This is the pattern of institutional erasure. Take a public resource, hide its true nature, and then sell it back to the public under a different name. They did it with the energy, they did it with the water, and they are doing it with the history. The tense atmosphere of the archives is not because the documents are fragile, it is because the truth is volatile. I sat in a reading room in London, watching a security guard watch me as I examined a map of the Great North. I could feel the weight of the forbidden knowledge in my hands. The map showed cities in the Arctic Circle that shouldn't have existed. It showed a lush green Greenland. It showed the Grand Tartary extending its reach across the pole and into the Americas. The guard cleared his throat. He knew. He didn't know the details, but he knew the vibe. He knew that some things are not meant to be seen by the unauthorized. This is the administrative order in action, the silent, watchful eye that ensures the narrative remains undisturbed. They don't need to burn the maps if they can just make you afraid to look at them. They don't need to kill the investigators if they can just make the investigation seem like a descent into madness. What if the administrative order is not a group of people, but a system of thought? What if we are all administrators now? Every time we dismiss an anomaly because it doesn't fit the facts, we are enforcing the order. Every time we mock a discovery that challenges the textbook timeline, we are acting as the gatekeepers of our own prison. The dissolution of Tartaria was only possible because people agreed to forget. They agreed to accept the new names for the old places. They agreed to believe that the mud flood was just a series of unrelated geological events. The intellectual provocateur doesn't just point at the ruins, he points at the mirror. The something else is the realization that the power to dissolve the order is in the same place as the power to maintain, say it, in the collective memory of the species. The administrative order is a ghost that only has power as long as we believe in the official hauntings. I walked back into the Chicago basement, the one with the copper dust. I looked at the wall again, but this time I didn't see a structural support. I saw a silent witness. I saw the physical manifestation of a no that was shouted at the world in 1850. The administrators said no to free energy. They said no to a unified humanity. They said no to the memory of the Grand Tartary. But the copper dust is still there. The vibration is still there. The administrative order is a thin layer of paint on a very old, very powerful machine, and the paint is starting to peel. Ask yourself, what happens when the machine starts back up? What happens when the subterranean voids begin to speak? The loop is closing. The pattern is complete. Not a mystery, not a tragedy, a revelation. The vibration in the stone of the New York Public Library is not the subway. I stood against the South Court's marble, feeling a rhythmic, low-frequency pulse that defied the mechanical schedule of the trains below. The official narrative claims this building was a triumph of the Carrere and Hastings firm, constructed between 1902 and 1911 on the site of the old Croton Reservoir. But look at the reservoir itself in the archival etchings. It wasn't a mere tank. It was a massive granite-walled fortress with Egyptian-style battered walls, a structure that looked more like a power plant than a plumbing fixture. The administrative order didn't just replace the reservoir, it inverted it. They took a massive water-based energy conductor and turned it into a repository for the very books that would overwrite its history. This is the institutional gatekeeping of literacy. They gave us the books to tell us what to think, while burying the machines that allowed us to be. Ask yourself why the most important libraries are built like bunkers. Ask yourself why the deepest levels of these institutions are off limits to the public. It is because the foundations are not made of 19th century brick. They are the massive, precision-cut megaliths of the Tartarian infrastructure, repurposed to hold the weight of 1,000,000 lies. The staccato tap of the researcher's keyboard is the only sound allowed in these halls, a frantic attempt to catalogue a world that has been systematically dismantled. What if the Great Depression was not a financial failure, but a tactical withdrawal? I looked at the production cycles of the 1920s and saw a pattern of excessive energy. The world was beginning to remember. The radio age was accidentally tapping into the atmospheric frequencies that the old world used as a matter of course. People were building crystal sets in their basements, pulling voices and music out of the ether. The administrative order panicked. They couldn't have a decentralized communication network. They couldn't have people realizing that the air was a medium of power, so they crashed the system. They called in the debts. They forced the population into a state of survival where the only thing that mattered was the next meal, not the nature of the universe. They used the New Deal to carry out the final phase of the urban restructuring. They sent the Civilian Conservation Corps into the forests to clean up the wilderness, which meant burying the last of the rural Tartarian outposts. They used the WPA to renovate the old city halls, stripping away the copper finials and replacing them with Art Deco concrete. Not an aesthetic shift, a containment strategy. They were sealing the leaks in the reality they had manufactured in 1850. I tracked a shipment of ballast from a 19th century clipper ship that had been salvaged in the Baltic. The ballast wasn't rock, it was a dense, metallic alloy that absorbed electromagnetic radiation. The administrative order used this material to line the basements of every major federal building in Washington, D.C. Why? To insulate the bureaucrats from the natural resonance of the earth, or to keep something inside the earth from reaching them. The tension of the capital city is palpable. It is a city of grids, of circles, of occult geometry that mirrors the star forts of the old world. But where the star forts were designed to distribute energy, DC is designed to trap it. It is a vacuum. It is the administrative centre of the dissolution. I stood at the centre of the ellipse and felt the silence of a dead circuit. They took the Tartarian grid of light and turned it into a grid of law. They replaced the organic, fractal growth of the old cities with the rigid, masonry-heavy symbolism of the new empire. They tell us that L'Enfant designed the city from scratch, but the excavations for the sewers in the 1870s uncovered tunnels that were all already centuries old. They just mapped them. They just occupied them. They just put a seal on the door and told us it was classified. The erasure trope is most visible in the way we treat ancient ruins in the Americas. We are told that the mound builders were a lost people who disappeared before the Europeans arrived. But the maps from the 1600s show these mounds as active cities, part of the Regnum Tartarii trade network. The administrative order didn't find abandoned mounds. They found a functioning society and they liquidated it. They used the Indian Removal Act as a legal cover for a massive ethnic and technological cleansing. They tore down the copper-topped pyramids of the Mississippi Valley and used the earth to build the embankments for the new railroads. They melted down the artifacts. They turned the Grand Khanate of the West into a frontier of savages. This is the somber truth of the American narrative. It is a story written by the people who stole the library and burned the books. They gave us the cowboys and Indians myth to distract us from the fact that we were standing on the ruins of a global high-tech civilization that had more in common with the Taj Mahal than with a wigwam. I found a technical manual for telegraphy from 1862 that contained a chapter on unintended signal induction. It described how telegraph lines would sometimes spontaneously broadcast music, voices, and harmonic tones, even when the batteries were disconnected. The manual instructed the operators to ground the wires immediately and report the frequency to the Department of Order. They were terrified of the ether. They were terrified that the ghost of the Tartarian world would speak through their own wires. This is the institutional gatekeeping of the spectrum. They didn't just want to control what we said. They wanted to control what we could hear. They moved the world from analog resonance to digital pulses to ensure that we could never accidentally tune back into the Earth's natural song. The staccato rhythm of the Morse code was the first nail in sent, the coffin of the old world's telepathy. They made us communicate in fragments so we would forget how to think in wholes. Ask yourself why the administrative order is so focused on conservation. Every time a large tract of land is declared a national park or a protected area, it is placed under the jurisdiction of a federal agency that restricts excavation. What are they conserving? Is it the trees, or is it the ruins that the trees are growing over? I looked at satellite imagery of the Amazon and saw the outlines of star forts beneath the canopy. I looked at the protected islands in the Pacific and saw the remains of basalt power stations. The administrators aren't protecting nature, they are protecting the narrative. They are keeping the unauthorized from finding the physical proof of the global grid. They want us to stay on the designated trails. They want us to look at the view, not the foundations. This is the geography of the lie. It is a world where the most important sites are the ones you are forbidden to visit. I spoke with a demolition expert in Detroit who had been hired to tear down an old power plant that had been built in the 1880s. He told me that when they hit the main support pillars, they didn't find steel. They found a series of glass tubes filled with a mercury-like substance that refused to spill. He said the air around the pillars felt electric, even though the power had been cut for decades. He was told to stop work. A team from a private consultancy arrived that night, removed the tubes in lead-lined cases, and then blew the building with dynamite. No record of the private consultancy exists. No record of the tubes exists. This is the administrative order in its most active forensic state. They are still out there, cleaning up the leftovers. They are still terrified that a construction worker or a curious investigator will stumble upon a piece of the old world that actually works. They want a world that is broken, because a broken world needs administrators. The intellectual provocation of the Tartarian theory is not that it might be true, but that it must be true for the modern world to make sense. Without the reset, the 19th century is a madness of impossible construction and unexplained catastrophes. With the reset, everything falls into place. The great fires are the cleanup. The orphan trains are the repopulation. The world's fairs are the salvage yard. The administrative order is the governance of the aftermath. We are living in the post-dissolution era, a time of managed decline and artificial scarcity. The somber reality is that we are the orphans of the 1850s, regardless of when we were born. We have been cut off from our heritage, our energy, and our true potential by a group of men who decided that a world of free people was a world they couldn't control. I stood on the roof of a parking garage in downtown Los Angeles, looking at the city's skyline. I saw the way the new glass towers were built around the old stone ones. I saw the way the administrative order had tried to hide the beauty of the previous age with the utility of the current one, but the stone towers still stood taller. They still had the better lines. They still felt more real. Not this, not that, something else. The something else is the persistence of the old world. It refuses to be completely dissolved. It waits in the shadows of the skyscrapers. It waits in the basements of the post offices. It waits in the frequency of the copper dust. The administrators can write all the orders they want, but they cannot stop the earth from being what it is. They cannot stop the truth from vibrating. Ask yourself, if you found the key to the old world, would you turn it? Would you risk the stability of the modern world to see what lies beneath the pavement? The final administrative order is a wall of paper, but the wind is picking up. The pages are starting to flutter. The investigators are starting to wake up. We are realizing that the forbidden knowledge is the only thing worth knowing. The loop is not just open, it is expanding. It is drawing in everyone who has ever felt like a stranger in their own city. The investigation is no longer a hobby, it is a duty. We are the executors of the Tartarian estate. We are the ones who will decide what happens next. The administrators are watching, but so are we. The hum of the power lines in the rural Midwest is a dissonant chord. I drove through the flatlands of Indiana following the path of a decommissioned railway that the local historical society claimed was laid in 1872. But the culverts were wrong. They weren't poured concrete or crude iron. They were precision cut red quartzite fitted with a tolerance that suggested optical measurement. The administrative order calls this pioneer masonry. Ask yourself, why would a homesteader with a hand drill and a mule carve heavy crystalline stone into a perfect hyperbolic curve just to channel a creek? They wouldn't. They were utilizing existing conduits. I found a series of surveyors' benchmarks along the ridge that didn't mark elevation. They marked magnetic flux. The old world didn't use maps of land, they used maps of force. They moved their goods along the veins of the earth, using the star forts as heart valves to pump the current. The administrators didn't just take the land, they took the pulse. They built the new towns exactly where the old nodes were strongest, and then they paved over the evidence. This is the institutional gatekeeping of the very ground we stand on. They tell us the frontier was empty, so we won't ask why the most fertile ground is always surrounded by military reservations or private estates owned by the families of the 1850 decree. What if the great storms of the 19th century were actually the side effects of a failing grid? I examined the meteorological records from 1840 to 1860, a period of unprecedented atmospheric electrical activity, dry lightning that lasted for days, auroras seen as far south as the Caribbean. We are told these were solar flares, but the timing coincides perfectly with the systematic dismantling of the Tartarian spires in Europe and Asia. When you remove the grounding needles from a global energy system, the pressure has to go somewhere. The sky became a battlefield of static. The mud flood wasn't just rain, it was a liquefaction event caused by the sudden grounding of billions of volts of untapped atmospheric power into a saturated crust. The earth literally shook itself apart because the administrators cut the wires. They caused the cataclysm, and then they stepped forward as the saviors who would rebuild the world from the ruins. This is the ultimate gaslighting of a species, to break the planet and then charge the survivors for the glue. The somber reality is that our natural disasters are often just the maintenance cycles of a machine we are no longer allowed to understand. I found a photograph in an estate sale in Munich, dated 1859. It showed a re-education camp for adults. They weren't in rags, they were dressed in the high-collared coats of the previous era, but they were behind barbed wire. The sign above the gate, translated from a stilted German bureaucracy, read, "Center for the Standardization of National Memory." This is the resettlement in its most visceral form. They didn't just move the orphans, they processed the survivors. They broke the continuity of the oral tradition. They told the parents that their Tartarian titles were delusions, that their technology was sorcery, and that their history was a fever dream. The administrative order was a lobotomy performed on the collective consciousness, not a war of bullets, a war of definitions. They redefined knowledge to mean obedience to the text. They redefined energy to mean combustion. They redefined humanity to mean labour. The staccato rhythm of the factory whistle replaced the harmonic resonance of the cathedrals. We became a species of the clock, ticking away the hours in a world we were told we had inherited, never suspecting we had been evicted from our own greatness. The tension in the modern smart city is the final tightening of the noose. I watched the installation of 5G towers in an old district of Prague. noticing how they were placed in the exact same geometric configurations as the copper-topped decorative pillars on the 18th century bridges. The administrators are rebuilding the grid, but this time it's not for us, it's for the surveillance of us. They are using the same Tartarian principles of frequency and resonance, but they have inverted the polarity. Instead of a grid that heals and empowers, they are building a grid that tracks and suppresses. They are using the administrative order to finalize the digital enclosure of the planet. They want to ensure that the next reset is permanent. Not this, not that. Something else. The something else is the fear that we might wake up before the concrete is dry. They are racing against our curiosity. They are terrified of the urban explorers and the independent investigators who are starting to look at the basements and the maps. They know that a single person who understands the true nature of the star forts is more dangerous to their order than 1,000 protesters. Ask yourself why the administrative order is so obsessed with space exploration. Every time they talk about going to Mars, they show us as images of red dust and ruins. What if they aren't looking for a new world, but looking for the blueprints of the one they destroyed here? What if the Grand Tartary was part of a celestial network that extended beyond the atmosphere? The erasure trope doesn't stop at the shoreline. It extends to the stars. They gave us a vacuum of space to make us feel isolated, to make us feel like accidents on a lonely rock. But the old maps show the heavens as a mirror of the earth, a connected system of ethers and waters. The administrators want us looking up at dead planets, so we don't look down at the living ruins beneath our feet. They want us to believe in a future of scarcity in the stars, so we accept that scarcity they have manufactured here. The loop is tightening, but the center is still holding. The copper dust is still vibrating. The investigation is moving from the basement to the street, and the administrators are starting to sweat.